Hi everyone, Drew from Navina here. I'd like to talk to you in this video about knee injuries, and in particular I'd like to highlight two aspects of knee injuries that we don't necessarily always think about when we have a knee injury and we are rehabilitating from it, or when we are trying to avoid getting a knee injury. The first thing that I want to mention is that our knee has more movement capabilities than we typically know, and therefore than we typically train. We mostly think that the knee moves through flexion and extension, and that's correct, but there are more movements than just that. The knee is designed to also move through medial and lateral rotation and abduction and adduction, okay? So typically, what we're doing when we are performing our training movements and to strengthen the muscles around the knee, we only move quite linearly. We typically train through flexion and extension only. And when we do that, it means that we're not training those other movements, and therefore those other movements get weaker. This translates to areas of opportunity for increased risk for injury. And so the second piece that I'd like to talk to you about is forces coming from the ankle and from the hip. Typically we see knee injuries, both acute and chronic knee injuries, coming from an imbalance of forces coming from the ankle or from the hip. Now, that might relate to muscles in those locations that have too much strength as it relates to muscles at the knee, or it might also relate to a lack of movement, a lack of mobility at either one of those two locations, and therefore the knee has to try and overcompensate for that, and it's much easier to overcompensate for it because it doesn't have the strength to support that force. So it basically just cops all of that extra force and is more likely to get injured. So what can we do about that? Our training regimen should involve movement at the hip and at the ankle that's focused on mobility, so gaining range of motion and making sure that we have clean function of the joints and the muscles around those joints. And then also today I'd like to show you a little bit about a movement at the knee that we can start to train. The movement that I'd like to talk to you about is our rotational movement. And the first piece of this I'd like to talk to you about in an open chain. What this means is the foot is freely movable. We can use this as a little bit of a tool to help us visualize the action. Find your knee at 90 degrees of flexion and hold on to the femur, the upper leg bone. Hold on to it so it doesn't do the movement. You want to focus the movement into the knee itself. Think about medially rotating and you'll see what's called the tibial tuberosity. You'll see it move as a result of that action. The foot will also move, but we want to make sure we're not just focusing on moving the foot because this is mostly ankle movement. Really focus the movement from the tibial tuberosity. You want to see it moving and then move through external rotation, and it moves quite a substantial way through external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. Try to find this movement first. Because we don't train this action, it typically is a little bit shaky and also sometimes a little difficult to find. Once you've found the movement, then you can start to add more load into it. For example, you could get some kind of TheraBand or elastic band, and you could anchor it down to some kind of stable structure on the side of you. You could give it some tension, and then you could move through with a little bit more resistance through that action. You could do that on the opposite side, same idea, to increase the resistance for lateral rotation. Okay, then what you can do is you can start to move through closed chain actions. So this was an open chain movement, the foot is freely movable. Closed chain means the foot is not freely movable, and therefore most of the movement that we'll visualize is the rest of the body. So that involves standing up. And you can do this by coming into a bit of a low squat and then hovering the back leg away from the floor. And then as you reach to one side to try and spread out in opposite directions, you're going to drive rotation at the knee. And you can do that in both directions, okay? Making sure that the knee is bent. If your knee is fully straight, you will still get some rotation, but the training effect is mostly going to be at the hip. So even though that's a good movement to train, mostly what we want to do with that action is train the knee. So make sure the knee is in some degree of flexion. and you are loaded, you're weight bearing of your own weight, and you're trying to send that back foot in opposite directions as far as you can, and you'll drive rotation at the knee, and because you have your extra weight on top, it'll have a stronger training effect. Okay? Hopefully that helps, and hopefully that leads to more comfort and ease at the knee.